Welcome, coming to our public meeting for the South Wake Conservationists. I'm Monty Murray. I'm the president of the South Wake Conservationists, and we are a chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and we serve the Southern Wake County and the surrounding area. And I just want to especially welcome any visitors tonight, in addition to our regular members. And as a special treat tonight, we've got Dr. Dustin Foote from the Sylvan Heights Bird Park, and he's going to talk about conserving some of the world's rarest birds here in North Carolina. Before we get started, though, I do want to talk about a little bit, for those that are local to the Raleigh area, that we've got some things going on. A lot of this month is about public engagement, so that's one of the things that we try to do on a regular basis, connecting people with nature, right? So tomorrow, well, not tomorrow, but Saturday on May 6th, we have our annual Kids in Nature Day. This is our second year doing this. We're very excited about it. Looks like the weather gods have smiled on us, and the rain is going to push out, and we're going to have a nice day. So we're looking forward to that at Lake Benson Park in Garner. We're also participating in some public events at the Lincoln Heights Elementary, where we maintain a pollinator garden. We're going to participate in their Tiger Fest. Bass Lake Park, which we interact with regularly, they have their annual Wild About Nature event. So we're going to be participating in that. And then on June 1st, which is about a month from now, our next event is going to be all about snakes. We're calling it Snakes 101. And that'll be a simulcast event, which will be held locally at Bass Lake Park in Holly Springs. So if you're local, please come. And if you're not local, we're also going to simulcast it on Zoom. And I just encourage you to subscribe to our website, southwakeconservationist.org. You can watch our calendar and join us for activities. Everybody's welcome. Before I turn it over, I do want to put in a little bit of a plug for a Senate bill that is before the North Carolina Senate right now. That's Senate Bill 318, which is the Native Plants Act. This is a very important act and could really make a difference in turning the tide on native plant sourcing and sales in North Carolina. It will require the use of native North Carolina plants and seeds on any state property and highways, and on local projects that use state funds for landscaping. And you can imagine the magnitude of that across the entire state and the purchasing power that that has. This could make a big difference in terms of nurseries carrying native plants and really starting to turn turn us much more toward using them throughout the state, and all to the benefit of habitat and wildlife. So please contact your state senator. At this point, I think Luke, who is our conservation coordinator, will give us a few guidelines on questions and answer, and then I'll turn it over to John Kinsella. And John is the vice president of the South Wake Conservationists, and he'll introduce our speaker this evening. So Luke?
Yeah, thanks, Monty. I'll just be real quick. So we're going to hold our questions till the end of the presentation. And if you'd like to ask a question, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's either going to be chat or the Q&A buttons. Either one of those will work. You can type them in at any point during the presentation, and we'll make sure to get to them at the end. So thanks again for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to John first, and then John will pass it over to Dustin.
Thank you, Luke. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dustin Foote, Director of Aviculture and resident falconer at the Sylvan Heights Bird Park. And Dr. Foote is also responsible for overseeing the park's living collection. And I can tell you it's a huge collection, so that's quite a responsibility. He has a BS from Cornell University. Cornell University has one of the best nature or aviculture type programs in the country, and are associated very closely with the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. Dr. Foote just recently, I believe it was April, received his Ph.D. from East Carolina, and his research focused on avian conservation genetics. Tonight, he's going to speak specifically about 4 programs they have going on at Sylvan Heights And I would put in a plug. If you're interested in birds and interested in conservation, then you definitely need to visit Sylvan Heights. It's quite a treat. Without further ado, I turn it over to Dustin.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm glad to be able to talk with you all today. So I've been at Sylvan Heights for about 11 years now, and I've had the opportunity to pursue graduate work for the majority of that time, and which has recently come to a conclusion, as John said. And so Sylvan Heights, for those who don't know, is a small nonprofit located in eastern North Carolina, and we're actually one of the largest bird parks in the world based on two metrics. One is just the total number of birds. So based on even like places like San Diego Zoo, we just have more birds compared to most facilities that you're ever going to see. And then in terms of number of species on display, we have more species on display than pretty much any facility that you're going to go to. We have over 250 species that we have on display, and we have about 5,000 individuals that we care for. Today, I'm going to be talking about 4 of the projects that we've been involved with for a while now. I'm going to be talking about North American hummingbird species and white-winged wood ducks, and those are 2 of the what I call the more on-site programs that we focus on. And then a few of our off-site programs that we've worked on for a while now is Brazilian mergansers and Bolivian flamingos. But before I get into those, I just kind of wanted to give a bit more background about Sylvan Heights because we are a small nonprofit. We kind of do everything in-house, from the construction to the bird care to the general maintenance. Everything is done by a relatively small, dedicated staff. And our main focus is educating people about the importance of conservation and research focusing on waterfowl and wetland habitats. And so we see about 60,000 individuals a year, and we see about 25,000 school kids a year. We have 2 full-time educators that do over 300 programs each year. And the facility, Sylvan Heights Bird Park, has actually been open, I think about 2007, so about 15 years or so. And it works in tandem with Sylvan Heights Breeding Center. And so the Breeding Center has been around for about 30 plus years. And it was apparent about 15 years ago that a new facility needed to be opened if people wanted to be able to experience the world of birds, as you will, because we didn't want people to disturb kind of the off-site breeding of the more rare species. And so the park opened in 2007, and we've grown each year. And my focus is the birds. Birds are what gets me going. I'm not the biggest kid person, but I think one of our meat and bones is really getting kids out in nature and really getting them immersed and connecting kids with science. And like today we had about 300 school kids, and they were having a great time. And that to me really justifies how and why we do what we do. So like I said, we have about 3 main programs: wetland biology, world of birds, and a kind of a hybrid of the 2 that we do pretty often for most of our education field trips. And then we have a few on-site activities that if people are just coming into a program that they'll participate in. So we see a lot of kids. And we are a tier 1 county, so we're in a pretty rural, economically depressed area. And so we do a lot of grants to get kids locally that won't be able to participate, to get them on site and get them hands-on with birds and science. So with all that being said, we do focus on a lot of species here at Sylvan Heights. We used to be Sylvan Heights Waterfowl Park. The inside joke is people showed up with bathing suits and swimsuits. They didn't really know what waterfowl was. And so we changed our name to Sylvan Heights Bird Park in 2009 or so. And that's when we really diversified the collection, and we really started branching out into other types of non-duck, swan, geese species of birds. And one of the ones that we've kind of initially started with is flamingos. And so there's actually 6 species of flamingos in the world. We have your African ones, like your greater and lesser flamingos. And then there's 4 New World flamingo species. We actually have 3 species on site. We have lesser flamingos, Caribbean flamingos, which is the typical lawn ornament style flamingo. the ones that are really, really brightly pink. And then we also have Chilean flamingos. There's a long history with Sylvan Heights and flamingos. And so this is actually in 2007 when we actually imported lesser flamingos from Tanzania, about a flock of about 100 individuals. And this is a species that in aviculture is relatively rare and they're relatively difficult to breed. And even though they're one of the most populous, one of the highest, have the highest population as far as flamingos go, they only breed in like 6 areas in the world. And so they're really prone to having catastrophic, they're really, really at risk for having high catastrophic influences. If one of those areas were to be negatively impacted, it would really affect the whole population, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And so what we did is we imported 100 individuals in 2007 to set up a captive breeding colony at Sylvan Heights Bird Park. And like I said, in the US aviculture, there's not a lot of facilities that actually work with lesser flamingos because they're relatively hard to breed. And so what we ended up doing is actually based on a few facilities that had limited success, is we realized that the flamingos really didn't need these huge spaces to breed in. We really needed to mimic kind of these natural high density colonial or colony populations where there was just a lot of birds in a small space, and you really needed to have those interactions to ramp up hormone production. You really basically what you needed is you needed birds bickering and fighting with each other in order to have them going into breeding mode. And so what we did is we built a small shed. The shed's only about 25 feet by 12 feet, and it was built for about 50 birds, so 25 pairs. And what we ended up doing is we lined that whole shed with mirrors to kind of simulate a higher density of birds than what actually was there. And that worked relatively well. And so you can see here, relatively quickly, we had success with lesser flamingos. Unfortunately, with lesser flamingos, it's kind of a general rule of thumb that there's always way more males in aviculture than there is females. And so we have a lot of male-male pairs. And with flamingos, males are actually considerably larger than females. And so these male-male pairs are just much more dominant in pairs than a male-female pair. And so we actually use that to our advantage because a male-male pair will defend a nest site relatively well compared to a male-female pair. And so because we don't have a ton of eggs each year, what we'll do is if we're not hand raising those birds ourselves, we'll give a male-male pair a chick to raise because they're just much more successful than a male-female pair. Besides lesser flamingos, the park has always done relatively well with other species of flamingos we work with. So you can see on the right, those are your lawn ornament or your Caribbean flamingos. And then even though this is an adult lesser on the left, that's a young Chilean flamingo. We do a lot of cross fostering with flamingos to kind of reinforce the pair bond. Traditionally, we used to house all of our species together and we would pull them apart depending on the breeding season. However, we realized over the years that that was not the best strategy because flamingos are really, really long-lived species of birds. They live up 70 plus years. They form really intense pair bonds, and it takes a while for that bond to develop. And so if you have birds from the wrong species bonding, it takes a few years for them to actually break that bond. And so what we did is we actually have 3 separate aviaries now for our 3 species of flamingo. And so the gray guys in the front are young Chilean flamingos. Because they live such a long time, they take forever to mature. So 5-6 years before they're really functioning breeding adults. In 2012, I think it was the 3rd or 4th International Flamingo Symposium was in San Diego. And there was a couple from Bolivia that presented, and our director, Mike Lovick, and my predecessor, Brad Hazelton, were there. And they were talking with this couple from Bolivia. And there was this really amazing occurrence there where the indigenous population for flamingos actually owned the rights to these large colonies of birds. And so it was ingrained in their culture that they would harvest eggs each year. And traditionally, it was kind of whenever people had the opportunity, they would harvest eggs, and it wasn't regulated. And so what we ended up doing is the government actually went in and said, initially they tried to just outlaw it, and that did not go well because everybody just went in and smashed eggs. And so what the government ended up doing is kind of synchronizing that event. And so they were allowed 1 or 2 days where all the indigenous populations went in and collected all the eggs. And they picked the days relatively carefully. And what it's actually been shown over the course of time is that it's actually helped the population. Flamingos only lay 1 egg at a time. They only raise 1 chick. And the chicks all form these huge, what they call creches, where they all group up. And so if you have chicks that are all laid at different stages, you definitely have bullies in the group, and the younger ones can be affected. And so by going in early and kind of getting all the young, the early nesters pulling their eggs, you kind of synchronize the entire colony. And so you would have 1 age group of birds, and it was just a much more successful management program for the wild population. The couple in Bolivia were the founders of a program called Biota. And what they did is they went into one of the only natural areas in Bolivia where the James and the Andean flamingo nested, and they would band individuals each year. And that's actually how we know that some individuals live 70 plus years, because we're starting to get band records from previous projects where individuals are literally that old, which is amazing. I mean, it's really only like an albatross that lives longer than that. And so what the idea was is when they were collecting these eggs, they were obviously collecting them for consumption. And so what they wanted was freshly laid eggs. And how they would do that is they would literally go in, collect all the eggs, and float them in the water column. And so if you think about it, a fresh laid egg has no air in it, and so it sinks. And so when an egg starts to float, it's actually been incubated for a bit, and those are the eggs they would throw away. And so for us, when Mike and Brad heard about this, because both the James and the Andean really have no captive colonies anywhere in the world, there's this population of people that are throwing away viable James and Andean flamingo eggs because they just want the fresh eggs. And so these incubated, valuable Andean flamingos are endangered. So these valuable eggs are just being tossed. And so there was this really amazing opportunity to develop captive colonies of James and Andean flamingos in Bolivia at 2 of the facilities in the country. And so what we did, they really had no idea how to do this. And so what we were able to offer as expertise is the term as far as how to collect, how to incubate, how to build facilities, and how to actually develop a captive flamingo colony. And so initially, this is Mike Lubbock, our director, and myself went down, and we were going to help them collect the first group of eggs. So we really got to see, it was one of the more unique experiences of my life, because even though these flamingos nest at like 14,000 feet, they're high altitude nesters, and even though it was only probably like 100 miles away, it took us like 3 days to get there, because their definition of a road is much different than what my traditional definition was. And so I've never been to a South American country before this, and it was just an amazing first experience as to how, how privileged I've been in the past. And so we're really lucky, and we saw a lot of amazing species of bird on our way to this high altitude lake where we were going to collect these eggs. And obviously we had to time this when the indigenous population was going to collect eggs, because we were tagging along with them. We were going to let them do their thing, and the eggs that they didn't want to eat, that they were going to toss, those are the ones we were going to bring back to the zoo in Bolivia. And there was just a lot of really cool waterfowl that I work with every day that I just didn't appreciate here as much as I did when seeing them in the wild. Like, these are puna teal flying. The white bird in the front is an Andean goose. That goose is a pain in the butt here, but seeing it in the wild was an awesome experience. And so these high altitude lakes, the one that we were really keying in on was Laguna Colorado, which is the red lake, and that's where you have this massive. It's this massive salt lake where you have both Andean, James, and sometimes Chilean flamingos nesting. And it's one of the few places that all 3 South American species nest. And one of the really cool parts about this project is, like, even though all 3 South American species occur in Bolivia, because they occur at such high elevations, most of the population really have no idea what a flamingo was. And so that was kind of the back end of what we were doing, why we were doing what we were doing, is because we really wanted the native Bolivians to understand that they have these amazing birds in their homeland. And so you can see those aren't flamingos in the middle ground. That's just kind of how the lake is because it's such a high algae and salt lake. But you can see all the flamingos in the foreground. So these are the indigenous going to collect the eggs, and even though it looks like it's not that deep, it's not that deep, but this is like the most intense mud that you've ever walked through, and it was much harder than I ever anticipated, and they were just plowing through it, and Mike and I were having a hard time. So you can see here they're up to their hips. And they have these kind of like wooden boards that they would make these rafts with, because some of the parts, it would almost like quicksand. And the more you move, the worse it got. They would bag the eggs up and they would bring them to the edge of the lake. And that's where they would actually float them to decide if they were fresh eggs or if they were eggs they were going to toss. And then they would package them. And these are the eggs that these were the fresh eggs that they were going to bring back to consume. So the eggs that they weren't going to consume, those are the ones that we were after. And so if they floated in the water column, we took them. We had our portable incubators with us. We had part of the zoo staff in Bolivia with us, and we showed them, how to transport these eggs. Because like I said, it took us like 3 or 4 days to get there. And so if you think about it, we had to transport these relatively delicate eggs across pretty intense terrain with only a car battery. For several days. And so it was a pretty unique experience. And so you can see even just candling an egg was a new candling is when you basically shine a high density flashlight highlight source into an egg so you can see what's inside of it basically. And so for us, it's pretty common, and it's something that I don't really think twice about. I can look at an egg and say, oh, it's been sat on for 2 weeks, it's been sat on for a week, about to hatch, what have you. Whereas with the zoo staff there, the whole process had to be explained. So you can see the difference. This is an egg that's probably 2 weeks old. You can see kind of the vein growth in the bottom of it. Whereas right here, this is a really fresh egg. All you can really see is the yolk in the center of it. You can see all that white space, all the albumin on the outside. This is an egg that's probably relatively fresh, about a week old. And so that membrane that encompasses the embryo starts to actually develop around the outside of the egg. And when you see that kind of halfway, it's a relatively fresh egg. And unfortunately for us, that's when the egg is actually the most fragile. That's when you wouldn't really want to transport it. So within the US, if we're transporting eggs between facilities, if we have the ideal scenario, like we want the egg to basically be like a few days before it's going to hatch, and then we'll transport it because it's a pretty stable unit at that point. But obviously that wasn't in the cards when we were doing this. And so we just took what we had. Before we went down to Bolivia, we actually sent the parts and the schemes for them to build incubators because they were going to finish incubation for the eggs at the zoo. Here, if you wanted an incubator, you can go online, you can order from 100 different types, depending on your budget. And you could have an incubator at your doorstep tomorrow morning if you wanted. There, they had to build it from scratch. And that was really highlighted for me when, in the back of this incubator, we wanted a small hole for airflow. And here you would just get a drill bit with a hole saw and you'd be done in 2 seconds. But there, they actually had a small little drill, and then they had a hand file, and they filed this. It took them like 15, 20 minutes to make this hole that would take us 2 seconds. And so it was really impressive to see the work that they did building this incubator. We kind of went through different incubation parameters. And so for us, because everything's digital here in the US, I can with incubation, there's basically 2 parameters you look at. You want humidity and temperature. Humidity is really important. Temperature is really important. With humidity, it's all about the weight loss of an egg. It's like I said earlier, when an egg is freshly laid, there's no air in it. And as it goes through incubation, it starts to dry out basically. And so air is incorporated into the egg as the egg dries out through the incubation. And so you basically want 15% from that first first time it's laid, you want about 15% of the egg's weight loss by the time it hatches. And that's pretty universal across all species, depending on across all incubation lengths. And so basically what you can do is you can make a chart and you can weigh that egg each day, and you can know if your humidity is right. So you need to raise the humidity because it's drying out too fast. You need to lower the humidity because it's not drying out quick enough, because you want a really straight line as to how quickly that egg is drying out throughout incubation. And that's just a really important parameter to pay attention to when you're incubating an egg, because ultimately that's really going to affect how the bird hatches out. And if the humidity is off, the bird's just not going to hatch out at the end of the day. And so here we are showing them how to take daily egg weights and make sure that the egg is developing at the right pace. And it was kind of cool. You can see right here, everybody's crowded around. Mike, the director, he called it like being crowded around a magic box, because everybody was just so interested in as to how this worked. And I mean, the fact that they took all of this and were successful in their first season is amazing. There's places in the US that just would not be able to do this. So the woman on the right is Sol. She's one of the main people that I talked about in the beginning. There was Sol and Omar. That was the couple that was in San Diego that Mike and Brad talked to. They were the ones that started Biota, and they were the ones that were helping the zoo do this project. This is Sol's son. He was one of the few bilingual people in the group, and so he was the one translating for most of us throughout this whole project. We got to do some really awesome birding while Mike and I were there. We saw torrent ducks, cock of the rock, violeteers. It was a really awesome. These are coonatiel. Somebody mentioned earlier the Lake Adelan grebe. So this is the Lake Titicaca grebe. It's an endemic. But we saw a really awesome diversity of birds while we were doing this project. At the end of our time there, they had the eggs in the incubator. And so the next step was actually, when the eggs hatched, raising these birds. And so Sol and Omar, this is Omar on the left, they came back with us to learn how to hand raise a flamingo. So this is here at Sylvan Heights. These are both Chilean flamingos. And raising flamingos is a relatively tricky process because they grow really fast. So most birds grow about 15% of their body weight each day. And with something like this, that has such long legs, you have to be really careful that they don't grow too quickly. And so the amount of food is actually really calculated. And what's in the food is also pretty thought out. And so they spent a couple of weeks with us going through the whole process as to how to raise a flamingo and how to formulate a diet. Here in the US, it's really easy to get a lot of nutritious ingredients. And so we use like a yolk, fish, and shrimp protein flamingo diet primarily. It has like calcium carbonate and vinate. Whereas in Bolivia, they had to alternate, they had to really adjust that to, it was mostly a yolk diet. And so we actually shipped them a few mega nutrients in order to make sure the birds were still developing correctly. Because they do grow so quickly, I generally don't like any type of hardware or bands on young flamingos. And so how we do it is we actually use a Sharpie and we just color code flamingo chicks, because each day they're getting weighed. So you need to make sure you know who is who. This is back in Bolivia. So these are the James and Andean flamingos eggs that we collected. And these are the chicks. Like I mentioned earlier, there was no really captive colonies of James and Andean flamingos before. And so there was just a lot of unknowns. Even though a flamingo is a flamingo, there's still a lot of unknowns when it comes to these two species. And so the staff was really, really good about taking a lot of measurements, a lot of observations, and producing a few papers just on how this whole process went. So you can see here, they're taking measurements. So they had really good growth curves for these individuals. It's really important with long-legged birds, with all birds, to get exercise. Everybody knows that bird bones are hollow, but they have all these cross structures in them. And most of those structures actually develop as a part of stress. And so if you have a bird, a young bird that's growing and it's not flapping its wing, it's not flying, they actually don't have as high strong bones as a bird that does get developed or does have access to those, a lot of flapping, a lot of flying, a lot of natural behaviors. And so getting the birds outside was relatively important. Here at Sylvan Heights, we actually weather our birds each day. They go outside during the day, so they're outside in the native environment, natural environment. The zoo staff, like I said earlier, wanted to show their visitors how amazing these birds were, even though most of the Bolivian population had no idea that flamingos occurred within their country. And so they developed this exhibit with a little bit of our input. And like I said earlier, the fact that they just threw together these amazing exhibits with the tools that they had was a really humbling experience for both Mike and I. And so they basically wanted people to be able to walk all the way around the colony. So these are just, after the first year. So there was only like 7 individuals the first year, and we've been doing this every year since. This is just chain link. And the crazy thing is, like, chain link, this chain link that they made. And so they had a tool that they actually wrapped strands of wire and then wove it together. It was impressive. This is how we do our ponds. Sol and Omar took really good notes when they were here. All these ponds drain from the bottom, and they're just really easy husbandry ponds to maintain. And the zoo was set in a really awesome setting with natural mountains. And this is La Paz Zoo. So I think the elevation was about 9,000 feet or so. And it was absolutely gorgeous. There was Andean condors flying around. There was a lot of amazing wildlife. And inside in part of the exhibit, they had kind of a timeline of the project. As of now, this is, I think, the 5th or 6th year we've been doing this project, and we've sent staff down a few times to help with the banding in December, and the banding is in March, but we've sent staff down to help with the egg collection a few times in December, and then the banding as well in March. And so the colony at the zoo is growing considerably, and they're actually starting to get ready to set up another colony at the second zoo in Bolivia. Bolivia only has 2 main zoos, and they're starting to get ready to set up a second one. The next project I wanted to talk about is Brazilian mergansers. So this is a bird that our director has been a part of conserving for a really, really long time. It's one of my favorite species of waterfowl. They're really, really gorgeous monomorphic birds. So both the male and the female look the same, but they're really different than our kind of North American mergansers. And the fact that these guys mate for life, they're territorial, they don't migrate. The male and the female both have because they stay together for the entirety, both the male and the female have a lot to do with parental care. Whereas with our North American, with our common merganser and our hooded merganser, even our red-breasted merganser, those are the 3 that we have in North America. Once the male does his initial business, he's done with parental care. This is a common merganser. So this is the largest one that we have in North America. You can see that this is a female. The male is white and black mostly. So they kind of look very similar to the Brazilian merganser in terms of the bill shape. We currently do not have any Brazilian mergansers at Sylvan Heights. However, one of the other endangered mergansers that we do have is the Chinese or scaly-sided mergansers. And so we're one of the few facilities in the US that successfully breed Chinese scaly-sided mergansers. So this is a hen inside one of the nest cavities at Sylvan Heights telling us to get lost. So basically what we wanted to do with the Brazilian mergansers, this is a species that only has about 250 left in the wild. And in 2011 or so, the Brazilian government realized that this species was just disappearing. And without kind of a captive component, the species was not going to be around much longer. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to collect eggs from the wild and develop a captive population that could then produce offspring to release in the wild. And because this hadn't been done before, this species, they looked at other similar types of waterfowl like the Chinese merganser, to develop this strategy. And one of the more important ones is a similar type of duck called the torrent duck that are also territorial whitewater birds. They're from the same area. And they're also relatively difficult to breed in captivity. And so when they were designing the breeding aviaries for the Brazilian merganser, they looked at other facilities that had successfully bred torrent ducks. And so a lot of them had these kind of long pens with fast moving water because they are what we call whitewater birds. They like clear water, they're visual hunters. And so when they were putting the initial thought into how to develop these pens, torrent ducks was kind of the main source of inspiration, I would say. In 2012 is when they first started collecting Brazilian merganser eggs in the wild. And so like I said earlier, there was only about 250 individuals left. They're one of the most endangered ducks in the world. And so there's really only 3 extant populations in Brazil. And so they collected eggs from all 3 populations. And it was a relatively arduous process because these guys are cavity nesters. They obviously don't want you finding their nests. And so they would nest up cliff banks, side of trees. And like I said earlier, when you're transporting eggs, especially something that's this endangered, you really want to pick your timing right. And so they would actually find out where these nests were, and they wouldn't actually collect the eggs until pretty late in incubation when the eggs are pretty stable. That's also something you have to be careful of because when you're intruding on the nest like this, you can have the bird abandon the nest, you can have predators kind of ID the nest. And so they had to be really careful about how they went about this. And even though it was difficult in Bolivia to transport the flamingo eggs, it was extremely difficult in Brazil because these guys were up major water systems, transporting these eggs back to the facility in Brazil. With both of these projects, both the flamingo and the Brazilian merganser, it was really, really important for us to kind of really just be part of the consultation part, providing, lending our knowledge, because it was really the local NGOs, local communities that were spearheading this effort, because these are birds that have a lot of national pride in both areas. And so we were really just on the consultation part on both of these projects. There's actually a nest here in this tree cavity. That incubator right there is actually just a modified regular cooler that hooks up to a 12-volt car battery, and that's how we would transport the eggs. The first Brazilian merganser brought into captivity was actually an orphaned individual chick that was brought in 2012 or so. And you can see that the yellow bird behind it is actually just a regular Peking domestic duck. With pretty much any type of waterfowl, you would never want to raise it by itself because they are gregarious. They really need to be with other similar species. And so this one had a foster brother of the Peking duck. However, relatively quickly, there was 3 collections. It was really important how they went about collecting the eggs in terms of they wouldn't actually collect the entire nest. They would just collect a few eggs from each nest to really capture the full breadth of diversity that was left within the population. And so even though there's 5 individuals in this picture, they're from 3 different nests. And they're relatively precocial things. As soon as they hatch, they're swimming around pretty quickly. I mentioned it earlier, but they're visual hunters. And so one of the reasons that they've been in decline is because there's been a lot of erosion, a lot of mining in their native range. And so the water is just not as clear as it should be. And so they really need clear water in order to see what they're trying to eat. The program is relatively successful, and within the past year, I think the captive population has reached about 60 individuals, and we've actually already in the 3rd generation of captive breeding. It's unique in the sense that this is actually birds from the first collection, and you can see the individual in the background is already pretty light. And so the fact that these are wild collected individuals that are already kind of showing this kind of inbreeding depression of what we call light individuals is kind of reminiscent of how like small the population has gotten in the wild. And so usually this is something that we would see like multiple generations into captivity when you have inbreeding and you're back crossing individuals to related individuals. But the fact that these are just wild collected birds shows how small the wild population is. With pretty much all waterfowl, you go through a waterproofing phase where you let them get access to larger and larger pools of water to develop the waterproofing. Because even though ducks swim really, really well, if you were to put a duck that's never been on water, it's going to sink. And so developing that waterproofing is part of kind of the hand-rearing process. Similar to the flamingos, because this had never really been done before, they took a lot of photos, a lot of metrics throughout the entire process to make sure that it was all recorded. You see they're just they grow pretty fast like flamingos. They grow 15-20% of their body weight each day. There's really no size difference between the sexes. I couldn't even tell you. I think the iris color is somewhat indicative. So there's a female in the front, the two males in the middle, and another light colored iris in the back. While these birds were growing, this is back in 2011, 2012, they started to build breeding aviaries because like I mentioned earlier, the whole point of this project was to develop a breeding population to actually source offspring into the wild. And so you can see these are long aviaries that are going to have water features running down the center. So you can have kind of these single pairs of breeding birds throughout the whole aviary. When the birds are young, you can have them in big groups. As soon as they hit maturity after a year or two, you really can't have them in big groups anymore. Because they're so endangered, it was really, really important, even though this is within a zoo in Brazil. It was really, really important to have a safe environment. So you can see these are aviaries built with stone and steel because you don't want people breaking in, you don't want predators breaking in. When we're talking about one of the 20th of the world population, you don't want something catastrophic happening. Again, they design ponds similar to how we do ours, where you have the lowest point is actually a drain pipe that you can pull. You can drain and clean the whole pond relatively quickly, which is really, really important in a captive setting for waterfowl. These are some of the adult pairs that are starting to, when you have them in the big groups, you can kind of see who's favoring who, and you kind of let them naturally pick their mates. One of the things that we did help contribute to financially was the purchase of a generator. Because there's electric wire going around all these merganser aviaries, there's running water, and it was really, really important for the zoo staff there to have stability in terms of electricity. And so there was a few facilities within the US that pooled money together in order to purchase this generator. Luckily, Mike and I were able to go down last year to actually visit the breeding facility in Brazil. And while we were there, it was just a really, really awesome experience to see how far it's come. So like I said, they're up to about 60 individuals, they're third generation breeding, and they've just done a really amazing job. I would say it's probably, as far as waterfowl goes, probably one of the biggest successes in terms of taking birds from the wild, developing a novel captive population, and they're getting ready to actually release individuals into the wild. And they've been working on how to track these individuals. So one of the main questions that they've had is where do offspring disperse to? Because that seems to be the biggest sink in terms of where birds are disappearing to. And they just don't know where young birds are going to and why they're disappearing. And so I mentioned earlier, these guys are visual fish hunters. And so if you think about it, traditional transmitters don't really work on them because they can't affect their buoyancy, they can't affect their the predator behavior, and they have to be able to transmit in these really, really remote areas. And so the past couple of years, they've really been focusing on how to basically put harnesses on birds that won't affect those in the wild. And they've had to go through a lot of different trial and errors in order to have a successful prototype. This is actually the first captive. So these are the birds that were collected in captivity. And this is the first captive breeding in the world of Brazilian mergansers, this nest right here. And if you remember back to the scaly side of merganser I showed in the beginning, it's very similar. You know, they pull a little bit of down, wood shavings, small group of about 5 eggs in a wooden cavity, and they're ready to go. And those are those four of those 5 hatched. One of the main individuals responsible for this is Robert Coy. So he's in the bottom corner. He's the director of the zoo. And he spent a lot of time with Mike. He spent a lot of time at Sylvan Heights. He's a really, really awesome waterfowl breeder. And so I think the main reason this program has been so successful is because he's kind of at the helm of the Brazilian merganser. This is a Tinamou photobombing. So these are all just birds that were bred in the last year or so. They buy in tilapia, so they're getting ready, like I said earlier, to release birds. And so the last few birds that they've been raising, they don't want them to be accustomed to a pelleted diet. And so they've actually been feeding them a lot of live food. And so this is just small tilapia that they've been feeding individuals. When we were there this past December or so, they actually had a clutch of seven or nine, I forget, birds hatch out. And it was on the day that we were there. So we felt pretty lucky. And that was actually one of the largest clutches ever recorded. So these guys are like fresh on the water. The next 2 projects I wanted to quickly go over is kind of more of our on-site projects that we deal with. And so I mentioned earlier that I think our bread and butter is really getting kids immersed in science. And I kind of take that same approach when I'm talking about conservation. And so I think for us, when I say the majority of our conservation is through education and making sure that the species that we have here on site are beneficial to their wild counterparts. And so these are the populations that I say are a little bit indirectly beneficial to their wild counterparts, in the sense that we're not actively helping with in situ projects. We're kind of on the back end in terms of providing education, providing knowledge, awareness, or protocols or what have you to their wild counterparts. So the white-winged wood duck is, I've always called it our poster child, if you will. So this is one of the most endangered birds in the world. Sylvan Heights actually owns all white-winged wood ducks in the US, in North American captivity. And so there's about 50, less than that, 30 individuals in North America. They're on loan to about 11 institutions. So this is a bird that's native to the Southeast Asia. They go all the way down into Sumatra. And there's a lot of variability in the wild population. So you have the typical guy up in the left corner that has the mostly black body with the white head. And then the further down in latitude you get these high white morphs. One of my favorites is the guy up on the right. Is a Thai bird, and they have all these mud flats. And so most of the time, if you see a white individual there, they have this kind of rust staining, and they're just a really cool looking individual. Unfortunately, in captivity, one of the main issues with white-winged wood ducks is that they're prone to this disease called avian TB, and it's from Mycobacterium avum. It's the same thing that's similar genus is responsible to human TB, tuberculosis. With TB, it's found, with Mycobacterium, it's found everywhere in the environment. So whether it's a captive setting, a wild setting, TB is there. Mycobacterium is there. Unfortunately, it likes wet, it likes dark environments, it likes high pH environments. And so you think about a captive setting, you kind of start to get higher levels of Mycobacterium. And so for waterfowl, captive populations have always had to be aware of Mycobacterium avum. And for a typical collection, I would say about 5% of the deaths maybe a little bit higher, are responsible or are due to Mycobacterium avium or TB. However, white-winged wood ducks, pretty much like 90% of the deaths that you see are due to this organism. And so for some reason, they just have this Achilles heel when it comes to Mycobacterium. And they've been in captivity since the 1970s. And even from the beginning, there's been this issue. And so people just don't know why yet. And so that's something that we've been working on quite extensively since the beginning of Sylvan Heights, really, is understanding why white-winged wood ducks are so prone, because that's really preventing this species from being established in any type of high density in captivity. And so what it does basically is it just really reduces the life expectancies, because they get these lesions within the body, and usually they die to some secondary infection. And so what we've realized recently is, even in wild white-winged wood ducks, is they just have really, really low diversity in terms of genome-wide diversity, compared to like all other species of waterfowl and other bird species. And so you can see here, this is a graph that shows just genome-wide diversity levels of various types of birds. The further down you get, generally the more rare the species is. So that Nippon is the Japanese crested ibis. They went down to like 7 individuals, almost extinct. They were rediscovered. They're one of the more rare species of birds. And the white-winged wood duck is on par with, in terms of genome-wide diversity, as those guys. And so we think that's one of the reasons that they're so prone to this disease, specifically because of MHC. And so I just wanted to give you a brief background as to what that means. So the MHC is the major histocompatibility complex. And in layman's term, it basically, if you and I are both exposed to the same pathogen, it basically explains why you get sick and I don't get sick, or if I get sick and you don't get sick. It's these clusters of genes that function in the adaptive immune system to discriminate between self and non-self cells. And so there's 2 basic types. There is more, but there's 2 basic classical types: class 1, which is more on the viral side of things, and class 2, which is more on the bacterial side of things. And so generally, the more diverse your MHC is, the bigger variety of pathogens you can deal with. That's a gross generalization, but that's the gist of it. And so you really want high diversity in these MHC regions. And so what we've realized with white-winged wood ducks is they have, in the captive birds that we have, in the class 1 areas, they have really, really low diversity compared to some of the wild birds that we've been able to sample. And so you can see here, these 2 graphs, this is diversity in class 1 and class 2 exons within white-winged wood ducks. And we have 3 groups. We have 7 wild individuals, and we have about 20 captive individuals. As you can see, for class 1 white-winged wood ducks, the wild birds just have much higher diversity than our 2 groups of captive birds. And the reason that there's 2 groups of captive birds is one's a historical, like 1990s population, and one's a like 2010 population. And so we think it's something to do with this low diversity that's causing the wild birds that we have to be so susceptible to avian TB. So the next step that we're starting to work on now is kind of pinpointing where within the MHC, is there specific genes that aren't working? Is there specific pathways that aren't working? Because then we can kind of understand, in terms of the breeding side of things, like maybe there's some individuals that should not be contributing to the population. If we collect new individuals from the wild, are there populations that we should be targeting that have high diversity that could really benefit the captive population? And so that's kind of the next step that we're working on with the white-winged wood duck. The last thing I wanted to talk about is a project we've been working on since 2014. And so in aviculture, one of the more difficult species to work with is hummingbirds. They're really, really small. For being so small, though, they are ferocious little things. They're one of my favorite species to work with. But within North America, there's not many facilities that have North American hummingbird species in any type of captive propagation setting, because they are so difficult. There's a few facilities in their native range that basically have glass domes over native habitat that have like some type of successful breeding, but that's not due to anything specific other than the fact that they're in their native area It's a big glass dome, and they're having some success there. So there's very few facilities that have success outside of their native range. And so what we wanted to do with Toledo Zoo was we wanted to develop North American husbandry protocols for certain species of hummingbirds, because there's certain species that are declining, and a captive population is probably going to be an important part of that future population. And so we wanted to start developing some protocols based on species that were either relatively non-migratory or had higher populations before we started focusing on some of the more rare species. So the ones we picked were the Costas and the Anna's hummingbirds. Again, they had relatively reduced migratory patterns, and they're both relatively plentiful in the Southwest. And what we ended up doing with Toledo Zoo staff is we actually went to Arizona with scientific collecting permits to collect individuals to seed a captive population. And so we were backpacking in these gullies, looking for signs of hummingbirds, and we would put up these feeders in order to set up what we call HAL traps, HAL traps. And it was really, really cool experience, because a lot of these had, fires a part of the natural cycle out there. And so a lot of these gullies had, fire scars. And I'd never really been able to hike in an area like this. And it was just a really, really cool experience. And so we used these HAL traps. If we knew a hummingbird was in the area and was using our feeders, we would basically place this drawstring trap where the feeder was in order to collect an individual. And this was all sanctioned and regulated by both the Arizona State and Game and the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so there was very, very strict areas where we could collect birds, number of species, number of individuals. It was a very strict collection. Once we knew where the birds were, it was pretty much a waiting game. And so we would be hiding in the bush with the drawstring. You can see the string going through the middle of the area, and basically waiting for a bird to go in order to drop the string. Because we were in such remote areas, we had these kind of field stations where we would put the birds into for transporting them back to our field, our base field. There we had constructed these kind of temporary holding. And so because we were working with Toledo Zoo, the birds had to actually be quarantined at Toledo before they were split between Toledo Zoo and Sylvan Heights. So this whole process took a couple weeks to do. Hummingbirds are nectivorous, and they have a super high metabolism. And so making sure they had access to food is critical. I mean, even within like 15 to 20 minutes, in the middle of the day when they're awake and they're moving, 15, 20 minutes is a long time for them not to have food. And so we had to be really careful during the transportation process with these guys. I was amazed, like I said earlier, hummingbirds are pretty, for being so small, they have a boatload of personality. And I was amazed at how quickly these guys habituated into using feeders, and how quickly they developed a sense of ownership over their new spaces. These were the boxes that we transported them back in through FedEx. We actually scheduled a private FedEx plane. It was one of the more expensive FedEx shipments that I've ever done, from Arizona to Toledo to go through the quarantine process. We had our own plane. We sat in the cargo to transport these guys. Once they went through quarantine, we split up the groups. And so Sylvan Heights was focused on broadbill hummingbirds and Costa hummingbirds, whereas Toledo Zoo was really focused on Anna's hummingbirds. And so we had a few different aviaries that they went into. We have our Wings of the Tropics, and we have off-site breeding spaces. And like I mentioned earlier, these guys are super, super difficult. They're so small that even in an aviary like this, if you have other birds, all it takes is even a relatively docile species having a bad day and wing slapping a hummingbird, and that's game over. So we had to be really careful as to how we manage these species, these individuals in captivity. We fed ours a commercial diet, which is also something we had to actually transition them onto. And so a lot of people think that they were just getting sugar water, That's not the case. That's just something that you would supplement wild birds with. In reality, hummingbirds are relatively, especially when they have chicks, they're relatively insectivorous. And then the nectar that they're getting is also high in protein as well. And so the diet that they're getting is actually a commercially made hummingbird diet, I think from Germany, that we use called Nectar Plus, that we transitioned our birds onto. We realized relatively quickly that in order to have breeding success, we were going to have these guys in their own spaces, because all it took, they would build these nests on the tips of these little branches that you see in the right corner. And then we would have like a tarantula or something land on it, and it would just, the eggs would go flying, the nest would go flying, and that, months of work went down the drain. And so we moved all of our birds into their own areas in off-exhibit greenhouses. And we modeled these after facilities in Europe that had success with more tropical species of hummingbirds, where you would have a central aviary that had a male, and then you would have female aviaries around that. So everybody had their own space and territory. And then when a female was nest building, you could allow the male access to her space. So otherwise, they're such territorial individuals that they would just fight the whole time. And so you had to have their own spaces for most of the year. Happy to say that 2 years ago, we were one of the first facilities, one of the few facilities in a long time that actually successfully bred Costa hummingbirds. And so this was after multiple years of like getting so close. We had eggs, we had chicks, so many ups and downs. And so it was really, really awesome when everything came together and we finally produced youngsters. And so I have a bit of a time lapse of the two chicks growing. And the top of this nest cup is like the size of like a nickel maybe. So these are small eggs. But the crazy thing is that by like 20 days, like they're flying around. They grow so fast. And so we had fruit fly cultures going through this entire time, and we would take a dip net to the local fields 6-7 times a day and just get as many bugs as we can. And we were just flooding the greenhouses with insects, because the female spent a lot of time looking for insects for these guys. And like I said, they grow super fast. You can see the really cool thing is when they first hatch, the bill doesn't look like a hummingbird bill. And so that actually develops as they grow. So there's roughly about 2 to 3 days between each of these photos. You can see the bill starting to get a little bit longer. We had modified the materials that we gave the adults throughout the years. And so initially we kind of mimicked what they had in the wild, which was mostly like spider webbing. We would literally go around to the aviaries, collect spider webs, but the nest never really held up that well. And so this is actually a synthetic, like Halloween style spider webbing. And then we would also use like capox seed, coconut husk, and human hair. And the nest cups they built with those materials were just much stronger. And so this nest particularly held up really well, where in the past we actually had nests that after a while, the eggs would actually just kind of fall out because they weren't constructed very well. The birds grew extremely, extremely fast. And I'm not sure if I have another photo, but about 3 days later, they were already flying around. So we're getting ready to publish a paper on these guys with Toledo Zoo, basically just going over the positive and the negatives of what we've learned since this project started. Toledo Zoo actually has not had any success in breeding their individuals. And so we're getting ready to submit that paper to kind of basically put our experiences out there. So if people were to continue working with this species, which is something that we're getting ready to continue working with as well, probably without Toledo, that they would be able to use what we've learned basically in order to have success. So with that is all I have for you guys. And with that, I'll entertain any questions.
Thank you, Dustin. I'm not sure if you've read the Falcon Thief. I don't know if you've even heard of it, but I just finished it a few weeks ago, and it's really it's nice to hear a story where eggs and birds are being collected, legally in the name of conservation rather than exploitation and profit. I can't imagine all that went into, getting these birds transported back to the park.
A lot of permits, a lot of permits.
I can't imagine. A lot of dark rooms and a lot of questions, right?
Yeah.
But I don't want to take up your entire night here, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. I do have one right off the bat here. So I guess, like, how is your position at Sylvan Heights and, your adventures around the world, really? How has that, like, transformed the way you see birds in the wild and, in your backyard in North Carolina?
Yeah, so there's been a really good movement in the past, I would say 5 years, a little bit longer, where zoos are starting to really focus on native species. And so it's awesome for us to be able to work with Bolivian flamingos and Brazilian mergansers, but it's also really equally important for us to focus on stuff that we find here in Eastern North Carolina. And so in that lens, we've really started to look at, what can we help here in our backyard? What species can we start working with, whether it's a captive population, whether it's outreach, whether it's just awareness. I've really started to look at how we can help the species that we see every day.
That's something we really push at the Wildlife Federation too.
So when you mentioned earlier about the native plant thing, like, we just got a relatively large grant. So we have 15 acres of just field that we've actually historically just done with sunflower seeds. And we just got a grant to do a native, I'm blanking on the word, native native field planting. So it'll be 15,
like a meadow, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. 15 acres of native flowers and meadow. And
Why
so
not
it'll actually be managed correctly as well.
Great. Yeah, I know John said that he used to volunteer at the park and he used to do a lot of weeding for you guys. So I'm sure that'll be another task that needs to be done, right?
Yeah. The privet is always a pain in the butt.
Yeah, I know. But John, I see you had a couple questions here. Did you want to ask those yourself, or do you want me to read them off here?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
The first one was, in reading online the description of Sylvan Heights, they said they had the second largest bird collection in the United States. I was wondering, who has the largest?
It actually said second?
Yeah.
I would say San Diego. If you looked at, because San Diego, it's like San Diego Global. And so they technically own the wildlife park, and they probably have, they have programs in Maui, Mauritius. I think if you looked at their whole entity as one, it's them.
Yeah, I would have said San Diego. That doesn't surprise me. Another question I had was kind of skipping over, but I know you have cassowaries, and what's their conservation status? Are they endangered?
They're not endangered. There's certain populations that are threatened, and I think there's 3 species, and the dwarf, I think, is the most of most concern. I can see your question. We don't have direct plans of breeding ours within aviculture, especially within the US. There's enough of them around that if the facility wants to work with some, they can usually get them. So we don't have like immediate plans of breeding them. Most of the conservation part of them is really just awareness. I think like car strikes is one of their biggest issues in their native range. And so I think most of the conservation stems around awareness as to how people interact with them.
And then I guess the last question I had was, I was fascinated by, the topic you had, the thesis you had on your doctorate. Could you describe, that a little bit and find, any interesting findings?
Yes, I kind of breezed over that with the white-winged wood duck. That was kind of some of the highlights of the research, where we had 30 individuals, 30 white-winged wood ducks. We actually did whole genome sequences for, and so we were able to do some high kind of high caliber comparisons between specific regions within those individuals. And we had 3 different populations. We had individuals that were sourced from Sumatra, from wild population. We had individuals that were from kind of the mid-range captive population in the 1990s, and then recent individuals from the captive population. And so we were kind of comparing both the temporal and spatial populations as to what the differences were, and if we could kind of understand why they were so prone to TB. And ultimately, with the birds that we had, it was really just that those differences in the MHC, where the wild population, even though they had low diversity, they seemed to have higher functional diversity compared to the captive birds. The captive birds actually had a little bit higher diversity, but it wasn't what we call functional diversity. So in the MHC, you really want, even though their whole genome had higher diversity, the MHC just had much higher diversity in the wild birds compared to the captive birds. And so there wasn't anything unexpected in that. Really, when people ask me about that, I kind of echo the sense that these birds are so protected in their home range that, similar to the Brazilian merganser, there has to be a body of science that accompanies any type of proposed captive collection. And so really what we wanted to do was just kind of start the ball rolling in terms of understanding a bit about the science of these birds, so that partnering with a facility in their native range, we could begin posing to the powers that be a captive component be incorporated into the conservation of white-winged wood ducks. And so, like I said, there wasn't anything that we really discovered that we didn't expect, but we just had to put the effort in initially in order to have those findings to start the ball rolling with a captive collection component and conservation.
Thank you. I wanted to mention also just kind of a bit of historical information. I thought it was interesting that you were talking about the Jameses and the Andean flamingos. And I'm going to date myself here, but I can remember when I was, probably about 9 years old, there was an article in National Geographic, and it was written by an individual named Bill Conway, who for years was the director of the Bronx Zoo.
Yep.
And he actually made an expedition to the Andes, like around 1959 or 60. And I think that kind of put him on the map.
Yeah, so Mike actually was with him on that expedition.
Was he?
Yeah.
Well, you
Mike
learn something new
Mike
every
and Bill
day.
have done a lot together.
Yeah. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out.
Yeah. No, Mike, you mentioned Mike's book earlier, but Mike is a unique individual. They don't make people like that anymore. He's done a lot of amazing things.
Well, his book was certainly very entertaining.
So maybe it's like a final question here. Actually, I had one before that. So with, at Sylvan Heights, obviously there's birds from all over the world. What does it look like to, get them acclimated to the climate in North Carolina?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that Mike and Allie is Mike's wife, one of the reasons they chose North Carolina is because of the climate. Like, our winters are relatively mild. It's besides like the high latitude, like northern birds, most species have a good time in North Carolina because it's humid, it's mild. So we don't really mess with like eiders or other cold-bodied birds anymore. But most birds acclimate relatively quickly to North Carolina. So it depends on where they're coming from and what their background is. And so even with us being not too far from in the kind of the middle latitudes, like our even our lighting scheme, like we don't have these huge swings of photoperiod. And so for other facilities that are a bit further north or a bit further south, if they have birds coming from opposite, it takes them almost a while for their brains to acclimate in terms of what season it is. So we're in a pretty nice area in terms of birds acclimating quickly. And then we really don't get a lot of wild birds anymore. So like they know what a pelleted diet is, and they know the drill for the most part. And
so with like this instinctual desire for some birds to migrate, how is that Are
Yeah.
there migratory birds at Sylvan Heights? And
Yeah, so that's why I briefly mentioned it, but I didn't want to get bogged down. But like when I say the difference between a North American hummingbird and like the tropical ones, is tropical ones don't migrate, and so you don't have that kind of like intense migratory desire. And so that's the tricky part when it comes to North American species. And when we went into this, I expected, like, nobody keeps ruby-throated hummingbirds because they go across the Gulf all the way down in South America, and that desire to migrate is just hardwired. And so we picked species that had kind of just seasonal movements to kind of see how they would handle the captive transition. And to be honest, like they really transitioned quickly. And so I know with the National Zoo has spent the last like 5 or 6 years building a brand new birdhouse that focuses on native North American stuff. And so they got all these warblers in, and that's another species that people in the US have always shied from because of the intense desire to migrate. And so I think once you get a generation in or a season in, I think a lot of that stuff, even though it's hardwired, dissolves if their basal needs are filled. If they have food, if the photoperiod's right, the temperature is right, I think a lot of that goes away quicker than I would have ever guessed.
Yeah, I guess this time of the year we really do notice, how intense it is for birds to, the need to migrate. But I guess we can all rest assured that you guys are doing it the right way. I know I definitely want to go out there at some point, make a trip. But if there's no other questions, I guess maybe the last question we could do is, if you could, wave a magic wand and bring back any bird from the brink of extinction, which one would it be and why?
The brink.
And then I have a question after that.
Okay. Monty's always got a question.
I would probably go, because it's probably extinct, but it's not confirmed. But I guess I would probably go with the pink-headed duck. It's listed as highly endangered. It's most likely extinct, but that's one I've only seen photos of.
Look that up.
They actually had, there was a movie with Steve Martin recently, about 10 years ago, where he was, he was a birder, and he was in a race with somebody else to win the birding championship of the year. And they actually had, at least they said they were pink-headed ducks that were in that movie.
Yeah, Jack Black.
They've been gone longer than that, but
yeah.
I don't. You talking about the Big Year? Was it, or the name of the movie is called The Big Year or something?
Yeah, that's it.
I'll have to rewatch it. I don't remember the pink-headed ducks.
I think it came out in 2010.
Yeah, it was a good movie though. It had Olsen in it too.
Yeah.
So I've got a layman's question for you.
Yeah.
Seeing the flamingos reminded me of a question I've had since I was a kid, which is, how do those big birds stand on those skinny, long legs and don't topple over? And the legs don't appear to have any muscles in them. So how the heck do they stand up?
No, I mean, they have pretty good balance. I mean, most birds have a pretty strong innate sense of balance. And the main question I always get is, how do they stand on one leg? And usually when people are asking me that question, if you look at them, all of the person's weight is usually on one leg as well. We all pick a leg. And when we're standing there, usually most of our weight is on one leg, and the other leg is really just for balance. It's not supporting much weight. And so because they have better sense of balance, they can just pick that other leg up, usually tuck it in if it's cold out. People do that too. They just don't really think about it that often. Yeah, it's a good question though.
Thanks.
Do you think there's any ivory-billed woodpeckers still out there?
I never say never. I still have, when I was at Cornell, one of my classes actually got canceled because that was back, I have a shirt that says, ivory bird found or whatever, back when everybody thought it was rediscovered. And half of the professors at the lab of ornithology took 2 weeks off to go look for this bird, but nobody ever brought back photos that I would say are conclusive. But like I said, I would never say never, but I would say it's probably pretty unlikely.
I think it was good for that economy in Arkansas, or wherever that was.
Yeah, I would say there's no harm in preserving areas for it, and no harm in people getting into birding looking for it. So
Yeah, they made a documentary about that ivory-billed woodpecker sighting in Arkansas. And they built this whole town essentially off of the ivory-billed woodpecker and started renaming all the restaurants and the barber shops and stuff. So
Better than Bigfoot. So.
yeah. Do you have time for one more question, Dustin?
Yeah.
And this is from Ellie. I know Ellie. Hi, Ellie. So super interesting talk. Wondering if you were able to reintroduce a migratory species after breeding in captivity, would the species be able to, would that instinct to migrate come back if you were to reintroduce it into the wild?
I would think so, but when you're reintroducing or even introducing birds to the wild, you have to be really careful about how you do it, because the captive setting is so different. And so generally you really have to put the bird through its paces in order to get it prepared to go back into the wild. And so taking it off a pelleted diet, getting it back onto whatever it's going to be eating in the wild, upping its exercise, making sure it has reduced human contact. There's a whole process in terms of reintroducing or introducing birds to the wild. And so I would say that the instinct would be the thing I would be least concerned about, because that's pretty core programmed. But the stuff that's learned while I was in captivity, that would be the stuff I'd be concerned about.
Well, thank you, Dustin.
Yeah.
And I guess that will conclude our presentation. Yeah.
Awesome.
Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dustin. It was a great presentation.
Well, thank you.
And, you
Hope you guys will
know,
come.
say hello to your family.
I will.
Hey, guys.
Yes.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Yep.